Today we're testing something simple, cheap, and a little bit interesting. What happens when you eat only cheap protein foods for 5 days? Not fancy meals, not expensive shakes, just budget-friendly protein foods that regular people can actually buy and repeat. And I think this challenge matters because a lot of people want to eat better, feel fuller, and stay on budget at the same time. But most of the advice online makes it sound complicated. So for the next 5 days, we're keeping it basic and asking one question. Can cheap protein actually keep you full and satisfied, or does it get old fast? That is the real test, because on day one, almost any challenge feels easy. The food is new, the idea feels exciting, and everything sounds manageable. But the real story starts when the novelty wears off. That is when hunger, boredom, cravings, and energy levels start telling the truth. So this is not just about eating protein. It is about what happens when your meals are simple, repetitive, and built around foods people often call budget staples. Things like eggs, beans, yogurt, tuna, sardines, peanut butter, chicken thighs, and other easy protein options. No overthinking, no complicated recipes, just real food, eaten over and over again for 5 straight days. And honestly, that is where this gets interesting. Because if cheap protein works, it could be one of the most practical ways to eat better without spending a fortune. But if it fails, then this is going to become a very long 5 days. Now, before we get into the actual meals, let's set the stage. The goal here is not to build the perfect diet. It is not about looking for some magic food. It is simply to see what happens when protein becomes the main focus of every meal, while keeping everything affordable and realistic. That means the kind of meals most people can make without a big budget, a long shopping list, or a complicated kitchen setup. And that is important, because a lot of people do not need a luxury food plan. They need something that is simple, filling, and easy to repeat. So day one starts with confidence. The first meal goes down easily, the food tastes fine, the portions are decent. And at first, cheap protein almost feels like a cheat code. That is one of the first things people notice with protein-rich meals. They can feel more satisfying than expected. You do not always need a huge plate to feel like you have actually eaten something. Eggs are one of the easiest examples. They are quick, cheap, and flexible. You can boil them, scramble them, or pair them with other foods. Beans are another one. They are basic, filling, and easy to prepare. Tuna and sardines are also fast options that do not require much effort. So on day one, everything feels promising. The food is simple, but not bad. The meals are cheap, but not useless. And the challenge feels possible. But the first day is never the real challenge. The first day is the easy part. What matters more is what happens when the same idea gets repeated again and again. Because eating cheap protein once is one thing. Eating it for 5 days straight is something else entirely, and that is where the mental side starts to matter. By the time day 2 arrives, the challenge starts to feel more real. Now, it is no longer about trying something new. Now, it is about routine. This is the point where people usually start asking different questions. What am I eating next? Will I get bored? Will I still feel full? Will I want something sweeter, crunchier, or just different? That is the hidden challenge of any food plan. It is not always hunger that causes problems. Sometimes it is repetition. Because even if a meal works on paper, it still has to work in real life. It has to be easy enough to repeat. It has to taste good enough to keep eating. And it has to feel practical enough that a normal person would actually stick with it. That is why cheap protein can be powerful, but also tricky. On one hand, it is affordable and filling. On the other hand, if the meals are too plain, the challenge starts to feel heavier. And that is exactly why day 2 matters. This is where the food stops being interesting and starts being normal. That may sound like a small thing, but it is actually a big deal, because normal is what determines whether a food habit lasts. A lot of diets fail, not because the food is impossible, but because the food becomes mentally exhausting. People do not always quit because they are physically starving. Sometimes they quit because they are tired of the same meals, the same textures, and the same routine. So by day 2, the challenge is already teaching us something important. Cheap protein can absolutely help with fullness. Cheap protein can absolutely make meals easier. But cheap protein also needs variety if you want it to feel sustainable. That is the difference between a short challenge and a real habit. And that leads us into the part where things get more interesting. By the time day 3 arrives, this is no longer just a food experiment. Now it becomes a test of patience. Day 3 is usually where the real adjustment happens. The body has started to settle in. The food is no longer surprising, and the mind begins to notice what is missing. This is the point where the challenge starts asking for more than just protein. It asks for flavor. It asks for variety. It asks for something that breaks the routine. Can cheap protein actually hold up when the excitement is gone? That is the question we will answer next. Day 3 is where the challenge either becomes a smart food strategy or starts to feel repetitive. And once that happens, the final 2 days become the real test. The good news is there is a lot to learn from this kind of challenge. It shows that cheap food does not have to mean bad food. It also shows that protein can make meals feel more satisfying than people expect. But it also reminds us that eating well is not only about nutrients. It is about whether the food is easy to live with every single day. On day 3, the experiment starts getting real. Day 3 is where everything starts to feel different. Not dramatically different, but noticeable. By now, the body has adjusted to eating more protein. Hunger is not the main issue anymore. Meals are still doing their job in terms of keeping you full, but something else starts to show up quietly in the background. Repetition. The meals are starting to feel familiar, maybe too familiar. It is no longer about figuring out what to eat. Now it is like going through the motions. Eggs again, beans again, tuna again, yogurt again, peanut butter again. This is the moment where the challenge becomes more mental than physical. Physically, things are actually stable with steady energy and no major crashes. But mentally, the brain starts looking for something different. Something with more flavor, a different texture, something that breaks the pattern. This is where most people struggle when they try to eat simple. It is not always about discipline, it is about stimulation. Food is not just fuel, it is also experience. When every meal starts to feel the same, the experience fades. So on day 3, the real question is not is this working, but can this continue? A plan that works for 3 days but fails on the 4th is not a real solution. Day 3 exposes that cheap protein can support you physically, but without variety, it gets repetitive. That does not mean the idea is bad. It means execution matters. When small changes are introduced, the same ingredients can feel new again. Eggs with beans feel different from eggs alone. Yogurt with peanut butter feels different from yogurt by itself. Chicken paired with something simple can feel more complete than just protein alone. These small shifts change the experience. That is the key lesson of day 3. Cheap protein works better when it is combined, not just repeated. That idea can be the difference between sticking to a plan and getting tired of it. As the day goes on, the challenge starts to feel less like restriction and more like a system needing creativity. Nothing extreme, just enough variety to keep things from feeling stale. By day 4, the challenge is no longer new or uncertain. It becomes strategic. Day 4 is where you start to understand how to make this work. At this point, there is a rhythm. Meals are predictable, hunger manageable, and energy steady. Now, the focus shifts to how you keep this going without getting bored. That is where most people either figure it out or give up. Cheap protein on its own is not the full solution. The real solution is how you use it. This is where simple combinations start to make a big difference. Instead of just seeing meals as protein, they begin to feel more complete. Eggs are not just eggs anymore, they become part of a meal. Beans are not just a side, they become something filling when paired correctly. Even adding texture or mixing ingredients changes how the meal feels. That is what makes day 4 different. It is about optimizing, not just surviving. This is where you start realizing that eating on a budget does not automatically mean boring food. It just means being more intentional, more aware of how meals are put together, more aware of how small changes can make a big difference. And this is also where a lot of viewers would start thinking differently about food, because the assumption is usually that cheap food equals low quality. But what this challenge shows is that cheap food can still be functional, filling, and even enjoyable when used the right way. It is not about perfection, it is about practicality. And by the end of day 4, one thing becomes very clear. This is no longer a difficult challenge, it is a manageable system. But there is still one more question left to answer. Does it actually hold up all the way to the end? Because finishing strong is what matters. And that brings us to day 5, the final day. By now, everything is familiar. There are no surprises left, no new foods, no new rules. Just the same system, repeated one more time. And this is where the result becomes obvious. Because at this point, the body has already told its story. Hunger has been controlled. Energy has stayed relatively stable. Meals have done their job. But the real test is not just physical, it is behavioral. Would someone actually continue eating like this beyond 5 days? That is the question that matters most, because a strategy is only useful if it can exist in real life. Busy days, limited time, normal cravings, and surprisingly, the answer here is more balanced than extreme. Cheap protein foods can absolutely work. They can keep you full. They can simplify your meals. They can help you stay consistent without spending too much. But they are not perfect. If the meals lack variety, they become repetitive. If there is no creativity, they become boring. And if they feel like a restriction, they become hard to maintain. So the real takeaway is not just eat cheap protein, it is how you approach it. Because when done right, cheap protein becomes a foundation. Not the entire plan, but the base of it. Something you can build around, something you can rely on, something that makes eating simpler, not harder. And that is what makes this challenge useful. It strips everything down to the basics and shows what actually matters. Not trends, not expensive ingredients, not complicated recipes, just simple food that works. So what happens when you eat only cheap protein foods for 5 days? You learn that it is possible. You learn that it can be effective. But most importantly, you learn that the difference between success and failure is not the food itself. It is how you use it. Because at the end of the day, the best diet is not the most perfect one. It is the one you can repeat without feeling like you are forcing yourself to continue. And sometimes that starts with something as simple as cheap, everyday protein foods. Thanks for watching True Health Tales. If this helped you, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next truth.